In the toward the end of the '60s, is that when the rumors about you being dead surfaced? Do you remember that? Do you remember how that started? What were your feelings about that?
What happened? Yeah, my feelings. What happened was we did a cover for a record called Abbey Road, and even the cover gets applause. And the idea was to walk across the crossing, and I showed up that day with sandals, flip-flops, and so it was so hot, and I kicked them off and walked across barefooted. So this started some rumor that because he was barefooted, he's dead. I couldn't see the connection myself.
No, I don't. It seems like a long, slow, difficult death. Being barefooted will kill you.
Scorched feet.
And how do you manage something like that? Because it was a global rumor.
Yeah. I mean, I just laughed at it and knew it was just because of the fame and the craziness. It was an American DJ, so you guys are to blame.
Yeah.
Not you personally, but no, the thing is, I just laughed it off, but it was a little bit strange because people did start looking at me like, is it him or a very good double?
Well, that was the idea. That was the other part of it, that there was a guy who looked like you taking your place.
No, well, this is him.
Yeah. Or is it?
Hello there, my name's Paul Martin. I'm a filmmaker, audiobook reader and comedian. This is my documentary on Paul McCartney's alleged imposter. I first became a fan of the Beatles in 1995 when I was a teenager, when Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr reunited to release previously unreleased music. My only regret at that time was that the original three didn't write more music together and didn't go out on tour. Beatles fans scoffed at the notion that the three remaining Beatles could go out on tour and could use Julian and Sean Lennon, John's sons, in their father's place. They said that without John Lennon, it would not be possible to have a Beatles reunion. The same attitude applied with Paul McCartney, since after all, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were by far the most talented members of the Beatles. All hope of a Beatles reunion was dashed with the death of John Lennon in 1980, pictured here with his assassin, Mark Chapman, who killed him 6 hours later after receiving his autograph. And yet there are many Beatles fans who believe that just as John Lennon was killed, so was Paul McCartney. They believe that he died in a mysterious car accident from either late 1966 or early 1967, and that he was replaced by an imposter. Let's then examine the evidence for this seemingly bizarre and preposterous conspiracy theory. The Beatles skyrocketed to fame in 1962, beginning with their very modest hit Love Me Do, in which their brilliant and highly innovative manager Brian Epstein is rumoured to have bought 100,000 copies of the single just to boost its rating. After Epstein's death in 1967, the Beatles gradually fractured and broke up in late 1969, after releasing their final album Let It Be in 1970. The Beatles broke up because John Lennon, Ringo Starr and George Harrison began to deeply resent Paul McCartney's domineering ways with the rest of the band. after they refused to cooperate with Paul McCartney or even pay him, he was forced to sue them, which led to the breakup of the band. In the decades that followed, Paul McCartney remained a great success as a solo artist. The conspiracy theory began in October 1969, in which a caller to an American radio station spoke for a long time and explained how and why Paul McCartney was dead and had been replaced by an imposter, and looked in great detail at the lyrics and album artwork of the Beatles. But it was based on several events which basically passed under the radar in late 1966 that, pieced together, appeared to build a strong case for Paul McCartney being dead. Small rumours passed around from late 1966 to early 1967, in which Paul McCartney was believed to have been killed in a car accident, something that the Beatles monthly magazine in February 1967 of the Beatles Book Monthly denounced as a false rumour. And this was a rumour that had spread across London that Paul McCartney, while driving in his black Mini Cooper, had had a car accident on the M1 motorway and had been killed, and that he had been replaced by a mysterious figure by the name of William Shears Campbell, or Billy Shears Campbell. Was he still the same Paul McCartney, or was he the one and only Billy Shears? Conspiracy theorists believe that the reason why Paul McCartney's death was covered up is because it is claimed that his death would have been so traumatic to the thousands of crazed female fans of the Beatles that there might have been mass suicides all over Britain over his death. But is this even plausible? Is this even possible? And would the British government care about an alleged potential mass suicide by Beatles fans? The British government in the 1960s was very busy fighting against Soviet spies, the spread of world communism in places like Malaya, and giving up their former colonies in Africa and other parts of the world. There is no way that they would have wasted time and resources in trying to cover up the death of one of the Beatles. This brings us to the conclusion then, if the British government was not involved in this conspiracy, and MI5 was not involved, then who? If Paul McCartney really had died and been replaced by an imposter, then we have to ask ourselves the question, who stood to gain by continuing to have someone representing Paul McCartney in the band? Who stood to lose everything? The answer to that question would be the three remaining Beatles, John, George and Ringo. It therefore means that if Paul McCartney really had died, it would have to have been the Beatles themselves involved in the conspiracy. In the 1960s, the Beatles had a net worth of roughly today's equivalent of several $100 million, so they stood to lose a lot if either Paul McCartney or John Lennon had passed away. The lyrics of a band can mean anything or everything or nothing. But in some of the lyrics, we do find support for this rumour of Paul McCartney being dead. At the end of Strawberry Fields Forever in 1967, John Lennon can be clearly heard singing "I Buried Paul." John Lennon later denied this and claimed instead that he had said cranberry sauce. You, the viewer, can listen to it yourself and decide what you think he said. And in John Lennon's 1971 song How Do You Sleep, which was dedicated to Paul McCartney, it has the words, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead." Another area of evidence which many Beatles fans appeal to is the artwork in some of the Beatles albums. On the front cover of Abbey Road, we see the four Beatles walking across the street. John Lennon has white clothing on, like Christ or a heavenly figure. Ringo Starr is dressed in black like an undertaker. George Harrison, in rough denim, looks like a gravedigger. And Paul McCartney, who is out of step with the other three and barefooted, appears to be a corpse. Then there is the 1970 Let It Be album, in which Paul McCartney looks at the viewer like a deer caught in headlights with red blood in the background, while the other three Beatles look the other way with white in the background. In the 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul has an arm badge that says OPD, which stands for officially pronounced dead. These mysterious and cryptic pictures can mean anything or nothing at all. But they are just that, pictures and nothing more. We can't base any hard evidence merely upon a band's album artwork. We have to look for harder evidence than that. Now that we've examined the lyrics and album artwork of the Beatles, we've had to conclude that in and of themselves they're not hard evidence for anything, but they nevertheless do support the hypothesis that Paul was dead and replaced by an imposter. But the biggest piece of evidence of all is Paul McCartney's physical body. Did it change? Is he the same person from the early 1960s as to today? While all of us get older and change in our looks slightly, there are several things that do not change in a person beyond adulthood. Beyond adulthood, a person's height does not get significantly taller. If anything, it gets slightly shorter in old age. What also does not change is a person's shape of their skull and the distance between their nose, eyes and chin. We will then examine Paul McCartney before and after 1967 to see if there's any evidence for this bizarre conspiracy theory. It's important then to examine Paul McCartney's height before and after his alleged death. It's important to remember that a person's true height can be distorted due to the shoes they're wearing, or as we see in these before and after photos of Paul McCartney with his then girlfriend Jane Asher. When we examine Paul McCartney in the early 1960s, he appears to be slightly shorter than John Lennon. John and Paul are slightly taller than George Harrison and significantly taller than Ringo Starr, who is the shortest of them all. Now we examine Paul McCartney after 1967. He appears to have suddenly taken on a good few centimetres or a couple of inches in extra height over John Lennon. Is it the same Paul McCartney, or were the Beatles having a laugh at our expense? When we compare John Lennon, for example, from 1963 to 1974, we see that his face remains the same. He looks a bit older and mature at the age of 34 than he does from the age of 23, but his nose remains the same. His chin, the shape of his skull, his eyes, the distance between his eyes, nose and chin remains exactly the same. But that probably explains why there's no conspiracy theory that Lennon was replaced by an imposter. We also find the same consistency with Jane Asher, Paul McCartney's girlfriend of the time. Let's then examine Paul McCartney's face prior to 1967. We see that he has a round, pudgy face, prominent ears, which would be nicknamed big ears, a thin, short nose, a double chin, and dark hazel eyes. Then, from 1967, his face seems to change in oh so many ways. He has light hazel eyes, a long thin face, a long nose, and a thin chin. Suddenly, Paul McCartney is not half the man he used to be. This conspiracy theory may be bizarre, but so are the changes to Paul McCartney's face, and we can clearly see that they do not match up. The actress Jane Asher, who was Paul McCartney's girlfriend from 1963 to 1968, has remained largely silent over her relationship with Paul. From the little she has said, she claims that Paul McCartney seemed to turn into a different person in 1967, which led to the breakup of their relationship over his drug addiction and womanizing tendencies. A valid question that skeptics will ask is, if the Beatles were trying to cover up Paul McCartney's death, then why did they leave clues in the lyrics and album artwork of their music? The simple answer is that none of the clues they give prove anything, and none of them show explicitly that Paul McCartney really is dead. It's a cultural phenomena known throughout England and Ireland as taking the piss out of people, where you insult them or call them a name or tell them something without them necessarily knowing what you mean, or even working out what you're saying to them. Many English and Irish get great amusement out of doing this. Given that the Beatles had a rather sour breakup in 1969, if this conspiracy is true, then we must wonder, why did Paul's former bandmates not betray him? The simple fact is that they were partners in crime. As members of the British Empire, which they had been awarded, identity theft would be a very serious crime. Even though they may have initially wanted to destroy Paul McCartney's career, they would not want to destroy their own in the process. And the ill feeling between the Beatles soon dissipated, and they made friends again, as is seen in this last photo of Paul McCartney and John Lennon together in 1974. Another interesting tidbit of information is the case of Bettina Hubers, the German alleged daughter of Paul McCartney, whose mother Erica was in a relationship with Paul at the time that she was born in the early 1960s. When the Beatles went to Germany in the 1960s, Paul McCartney was ordered by the German government to pay maintenance to the daughter. On several occasions since the 1980s, Bettina has attempted to sue her father for parenting payments. Paul McCartney has given paternity tests, but they have come back negative. Another interesting piece of information is that Paul McCartney, like John Lennon, had 2 Irish grandparents and 2 English grandparents, but no Scottish ancestry. Whereas a name like Campbell, as in William Shears Campbell, is Scottish. It's interesting to note then that after 1967, particularly from 1969 onwards with his marriage to Linda McCartney, Paul developed a great love of Scotland and began living there most of the time. He even co-wrote with Denny Laine the Scottish classic Mole of Kintyre, which became the greatest selling single of all time when it came out. While this is not conclusive proof of anything in and of itself, it does support the hypothesis that he was replaced by a man with a Scottish name. What originally sounded laughable and unbelievable to me was changed when I examined the before and after faces of Paul McCartney. Regardless, however, he still remains my favourite Beatle and one of my favourite artists of all time. Whatever you think of this conspiracy theory, I leave it for you, the viewer, to decide for yourself.